Our first keynote speaker today is Dr. Lawrence Jones, the leader of Edison Electric Institute's international programs, and a wonderful personal friend. Lawrence has more than 65 member companies operating in 90 countries. He is responsible for the launch of EEI's Global Electricity Forum, the African Utility Power Sector Exchange, and the Thomas Edison International Utility Executive Fellowship Program. Prior to joining EEI, Dr. Jones held senior positions at Alstom Grid, where he helped formulate new technology solutions for his worldwide network of utilities. So Lawrence, it's your turn to inspire us.
Thank you, Clint, and good morning, everyone. Thanks, Elliot, for your presentation, which I found very helpful to kick things off. Let me just share my slide here and make sure I'm doing it the right way. There we go. All right, so my slide should be up. Can you guys see it? I guess you can.
We can.
Perfect. So first of all, Clint, thanks again for the invitation to be part of this conversation today. I must say that when you gave your the introduction remarks here and you laid out what has been said already, I asked myself, well, you know, who comes and speak after such a very prestigious group of people, and what do I say? And sort of being the closing act, if you may, at least to kick off the day, puts a lot of pressure on one. But be that as it may, I thought it would be a good thing to kind of start this conversation by perhaps putting in the context of three questions I've been asking myself of late. And the first question is basically, what if, what's wrong, and what's next? And the reason I say what if is I want to first, before I get into these three questions, what if, what's wrong, what's next, Clint already said a few words about EEI International Program and what we do, so I won't spend much time on it. Internationally, we work with utilities all over the world. And so like Elliot, I recognize the importance of having these 4 a.m. calls. Not the best, but nonetheless, it's fine. And so I wanted to come back to those three questions. What if, what's wrong, and what's next? So first of all, last year, exactly a year ago, I spoke at the Dentons conference. And I talked a lot about questions and the importance of asking the right questions, and talk about question storming, the idea of being able to dig deep into different questions. And when I reflect from last year to this year, I realized one interesting thing, that it's very easy to talk about what's next, but it's always difficult to sometimes go back and say, what did you get wrong? And what I didn't talk about last year, I look over the slides from last year, and there was not a single point in my slide that talked about global pandemic. Instead, I made a lot of statements about other things that I will talk about, all the mega trends that we know. But really, I never got into this whole issue about, you know, what's next. And so today, what I want to do is talk about a few sort of scene-setting themes that I think will resonate with the group, and obviously set the scene for a conversation going forward. First of all, you know, Elliot talked about communities, and I know this conference is about global communities and smart cities. And the question I have that I think the group can start to think about as we go into the day's conversation is, what makes a successful community? Because I've been thinking, currently today I'm in Boston for, you know, visiting with the family, and I'm just trying to understand what makes a community successful, what made communities successful in the past, and what's wrong today. Why communities not working? And I say communities in a much broader sense, and we'll talk about the global community in and of itself. So what makes a successful community? And Clint talked about one thing in his remarks. He did mention that during the week we've discussed trust, and trust being, in my view, the DNA for every kind of a community to work, whether it's in your home, whether it's you know, in a family, in businesses. Trust is such an important element of making successful communities. And so when I think of the three questions I want to dig into with you all, you know, what if, what's wrong, and what's next? I want this idea of trust to be an underlying theme in terms of how we talk about what makes a successful community. Now, in terms of what if I were to ask you, each of you on the call, to say, if you were to redesign your life as you know it today, how would you do it? Because we're at a place in time where a lot of the questions we're struggling with as communities, and by communities, again, more broadly, global community, local community, national community, personal community, whatever it is challenging us to say, what's wrong with us as a community? And if we were to redesign our lives, what kinds of assumptions will we make in the design or the redesign of our lives? Because remember, the community is only as successful as we are who make up the community. And when I heard the list of topics that were discussed over the last couple of days, one of the things that inspired me was the fact that a lot of the emphasis was on what I would call the social dimension of communities as opposed to just the technological dimensions. Normally, I would be having this conversation and spend a lot of time talking about electricity and electrification, which is what we do. But of recently, I've been spending time really thinking about what is really wrong with us as a community and what are we missing in terms of thinking about what comes next for our communities, for our cities, for our global community, as well as our local communities. And one thing that keeps coming back to me is I've become a fan of Benjamin Franklin, who, as you know, was one of the world's first, or one of the first leaders in electricity, but he was also a diplomat and a polymath. And as I'm thinking about this idea of what's wrong with us, what comes next, I begin to think about how would Franklin think today if he was here? If Benjamin Franklin were here today, how would he think about the world as it stands today? And what comes to my mind is he was a polymath, means he was a polymatic leader who was able to bring together all of his different skills to bear when he was making decisions. In fact, at one of the constitutional meetings that took place in Philadelphia, Franklin was one of those who spent a lot of time advocating for unity and looking for consensus. And Clinton talked about the 3 C's for today, for this week: climate, COVID, and I think the other one I've forgotten. But one of the other C's I will add to this conversation is what Franklin spent a lot of time talking about, which is consensus and community. And I think what's wrong with us, what comes next, and how do we prepare for a world post-COVID? We need to think about this notion of a polymatic leader in all of us. And that's one of the things Franklin spent a lot of time talking about. And so if you look at the mega trends that we've all been talking about for the last couple of weeks or months, or maybe even years: climate change, urbanization, economic power being shifted, demographic shift, technological advancements. But for some reason, we as a global community, as a local community, no one talked about trust or lack of trust or deficit of trust as a mega trend. No one talked about another mega trend, which is the sort of communities losing that fundamental DNA of trust, being able to function and be successful. And so, interestingly enough, as a global community, we've all missed that one of the biggest trends that were brewing underneath societies across the world had to do with this issue of deficit of trust. It had to do with this issue of the need for polymatic leaders like Benjamin Franklin, but then also giving us an understanding of how do we move forward after such a crisis as we're going through right now. Here is a slide I put up last year. And you look at this slide from last year, I talk about some of the grand challenges: climate change, urbanization, population growth. I did have trust deficit on the slide last year, but I hadn't thought about trust deficit in the context of the last bullet point here, which is lack of a shared future vision. And I think we're at a point where, as we start to think about what comes after COVID, we have to think about what shared vision do we have as a global community in terms of what we want the world to look like after COVID, how we design the systems, both, like Elliot mentioned, some of the international institutions that we have to take a look at and see how do we redesign them, how do we model them, and what are some of the challenges. And so this lack of a shared vision at the community level, I'm in Boston today, for example. What's fascinating me about being in Boston today is that I have not passed by a single person in Boston who's not wearing a mask, for example. So there's this communal need to wear masks in Boston, similar to what you may see in Paris, but then obviously in other places around the world, you may have a different view on that. So having that shared vision around what comes after COVID, I think is extremely important in the context of what today's discussion is going to be about. And so we need to start thinking new, thinking differently about this, asking some of the hard questions. And I'm sad to say that, or sorry to say that, last year I put up this slide about new thinking. And I thought by the time we got to this year, more progress would have been made around new thinking. And then COVID came, which has re-emphasized the importance of really new thinking about what comes next. I also talked last year about urban and rural communities, and we see this very, very clearly this time around as we now face COVID, is that across the globe, obviously urban communities have been hit the hardest when it comes with COVID because of population density, because of a lot of other issues. But let's not forget that rural communities around the globe are being impacted equally when it comes to COVID, but also some of the injustices that Clint talked about, whether it's racial injustice, social injustice, economic injustices. And so for us to move forward and be successful in the context of what makes a successful community, we have to wrestle with this interaction between the urban and the rural space. Because people leaving rural communities flock into urban communities, and that in itself creates more stresses on the urban communities. And so we need to rethink how we design rural communities or communities in general, be them in the rural areas or in the urban areas. In fact, I would go one step further if I had the magic wand and basically eliminate the term rural, because it's kind of funny when we see rural as being something in many cases, in many parts of the world, as being the other. So there's a kind of a classification of people living in rural communities that in and of itself creates a challenge for us as we want to deal with some of the challenges that we see COVID bringing us. This map of the world kind of illuminates where we see electrification at the most part. And interestingly enough, if you took a map of COVID-19 spread across the world, one of the things you will find very interesting is that places where you have more and more electrification, it's also places where you have high concentration of COVID outbreak in the world, which tells us that in as much as electrification is important for lighting up the world, electrification is also important for dealing with the challenges of providing reliable electricity for healthcare hospitals around the world to be able to provide the necessary access to electrification for dealing with issues around the pandemic. But I think this slide also brings up another point that I find interesting in the context of communities, is that supply chain, which is a part of the conversation we've had, has been brought to the forefront of the conversation in terms of how do we manage the global supply chain. And obviously the discussion has been around there will be more localization of supply chain, there will be regionalization. What I think is important is that because of globalization, we should all accept the fact that the global community will have to function for the global supply chain to be efficient. And for that to happen, I go back to again what we started from the beginning. What makes communities successful? Trust. So there needs to be greater emphasis on how do you build global trust if the global supply chain is going to work, especially in dealing with the world now, but also dealing with the world post-COVID. I'm not going to spend too much on this. The next slide that kind of talks about what COVID is, and Elliot talked about some of that in terms of what's happening in Singapore and other parts of the world. Just talking briefly, the IEA has done some analysis on the need for investments in what they call sustainable recovery, the amount of money that's going to be needed to invest in making sure that the recovery is sustainable and fair. And so that's something I think we need to keep our eye on. One other point I mentioned at my last keynote I gave at Dentons, when I talk about energy equals H2O, this idea of the water energy nexus, I think it's becoming more and more critical now as we see the impacts of climate change. We've beginning to see, even in parts of Scandinavia, there's no lack of water in Scandinavia, but Scandinavia is getting warmer and warmer. So the reality of climate change is beginning to find its way all over the globe. Places that were typically had cool summers are having much hotter summers than usual. And so I think the context of thinking holistically about climate, thinking holistically about COVID means we need to start to look at these different infrastructures in a much more holistic way, which means policymakers as well as investors need to start looking at these from a point where it's an integrated approach. And this is something I've spoken with Clint about over the past, sort of looking at the integration of all these critical infrastructures and how we deal with them from a policy, from a business, from an investment standpoint. The next two slides just talk about ideas around issue of question storms or questions. I'm not going to spend too much time because I want to get to this slide, which is what's next. So the emerging new normal. Elliot talked about the new normal, what's coming next, what do we want to call it, new normal, or the the new status quo. But I've outlined here a couple of points that I think are poignant in terms of going forward. One thing I think we need to keep in mind, given the fact that we're already seeing third waves popping up all over the world, that we're going to be living with a pandemic mindset going forward. And that means we're going to have to rethink all of the assumptions we made before COVID. And that is going to be hard because in communities like in other places, we come up with ways of engagement, status quo, and it's very difficult to break away from those status quo. And so the first challenge we're going to have in terms of the new normal is how do we rethink our old assumptions? And the assumptions around everything, our norms, our value systems, social injustice, racial inequalities, all of these things have to be reassessed, put in the context where we really understand what it means for communities. Stakeholder engagement, how we engage in communities have to be changed. Globalization, how we travel. I took my first trip this past Sunday. It's my first time traveling in 5 months. And I can tell you, it was a very interesting feeling being on an airplane. Even the way we deboarded the plane was very interesting because now you don't deboard the plane with everyone rushing. You had to wait for your seat number to be called before you deboarded the plane. And so all of these kinds of things will affect how life goes on moving forward. We need to reevaluate how we create value for our customers, for our society, what we measure, what are the performance metrics of a successful community. I have been one of those asking the question for many years now, is GDP the best metric for deciding whether or not a successful society is successful? Because we see today that in many parts of the world where you have one of the highest GDP, you also have situations where we've poorly managed dealing with the pandemic. So there is no guarantee that because you have a high GDP, you will inevitably be able to deal with some of the challenges facing us going forward. So to sum it up, I come back to where I talked about the need for polymatic leaders like Benjamin Franklin in communities. Franklin inspired me a lot because not just because he was an electrical engineer, genius in the sense of what he did with regards to electrifying or identifying lightning and being the father of electricity. But as you read his workings, you realize that he was really committed to the community. He was all about helping the communities to prosper. And I think in terms of polymatic leaders, we need leaders going forward who will take a holistic view at every crisis they're dealing with, because we can no longer solve community crisis in isolation. Whether you're dealing with healthcare, whether you're dealing with policing, all of these things are interrelated. So we need this sort of a polymatic approach to what we're going to deal with. And the last point I would mention, I'm not sure if it's been discussed this week, but I think the issue of security and resilience are very important. And I'm not just talking about cybersecurity or physical security. I'm also talking about human security. Mental health, according to the World Health Organization, is going to be one of the biggest challenges facing us after this pandemic. And unfortunately, I'm not hearing a lot of discussions about mental health in communities. We're spending a lot of time at home on virtual platforms. We're communicating like this. But now more and more studies are being done to show that the pandemic is going to have a psychological impact on society. And I think it behooves us, as we think of communities, to start thinking really seriously about the impact of working at home, working in front of a computer 24/7. What are the psychological impacts in the long term? And so, Clint, I will end here by just saying what I started. What makes a successful community, starting with trust, having a lot of discussions around trust, and really going back and looking at some of these core assumptions we've made thus far. So with that, I'll thank you, and I'll be happy to take your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Lawrence. Beautiful message. and inspiring as always. It's amazing how many vital subjects related to smart cities and communities we've received in your discussion today, and yet you still managed to keep us on track in terms of our timing. I do have one anonymous question in the Q&A feature of the platform, and the question is the warming of Earth releasing germs to cause COVID? I'm not sure if you have the medical background to address that.
What was the
Lawrence.
question, Clint? What was the question?
Is the warming, let me get that back up. I'm not seeing it now, but is global warming essentially releasing the germs that cause COVID?
So I don't know if I can answer the specific question about the germs. One of the things we do know we see is that global warming is having an impact on our natural habitat. And we know that that is affecting how species are moving around the planet in terms of just, we see now this proximity that's coming between us and nature. I wouldn't know whether specifically that the germs are being spread because of global warming, but I think the heating of the planet is causing devastating impacts on our natural habitat. And to the extent, that's something I think we need to study more in terms of what's happening as we affect the climate, in the sense that we may even bring up viruses or diseases or other things that have been at the coast of the earth for a long time. And so I don't know if it's a direct correlation, but I won't be surprised if someone does some work and finds a correlation there.
Certainly the results of global warming already have had devastating consequences across the globe in many different ways, from the release of pine bark beetles destroying forests to there have also been dramatic shifts already in the different demographic regions. So it is one of our highest priorities. About 80% of pollution comes from urban areas. And so if we can make major changes in urban areas through reduction of pollution, much greater efficiency and conservation, changes in transportation patterns, it'll be very interesting to see the analytics associated with future remote working. Elliot mentioned, Elliot, you might want to just talk for 1 minute or two about the surveys we've taken within our law firm regarding remote working in the future.
Very, very happy to. First, I just say in response to Dr. Jones, we're actually spending a lot of time talking about resilience of our people, to your point about mental health, because what we're finding is just the challenges that many of our people have. And we've had at the max about 15,000 of our 19,000 people have been working remotely. The numbers are down a little bit, but people working from home unexpectedly with spouses and partners and kids in smaller spaces than they ever would have imagined, creating its own share of challenges. But we actually think the greater challenge is now that people understand the long-term prolonged nature of this pandemic, and they confront the reality that their kids may not be going back to school in the autumn when they anticipated, may not have childcare, may be caring for older relatives, that the impact on mental health is profound. And frankly, most of our people, like most around the world, just don't necessarily have the tools to be able to be as resilient personally and emotionally as we would want them to be. And so we've been surveying our colleagues. One of the things we're finding is the programs we're putting on to help them with their personal resilience, with their well-being, have been the most popular things we've done, as people are quite understandably facing a very uncertain future. And while everyone hoped we'd be done talking about the pandemic from now. Well, we're through with it. It's not through with us. And it's going to be another 12 months. So we share that view about the real importance of focusing, not on whether you have a standing desk or a ring light so you look better on your Zoom calls, but actually how you emotionally support people through a very trying period of time. So very much agree, and we're hearing a lot from all our people around the world, and it's not limited to any particular jurisdiction. It's a global set of challenges.
Ken, may I just say something briefly before, since Ellie's still here? So one of the things I've been involved with the last couple of weeks, just as a little exercise, started this sort of an opportunity where we bring together a few people to do this something we call question storming. And Clint, you're aware of it. So one of the things we've done, we've convened people, no more than 10 people on a call to just talk about trust. And what has been so fascinating, and we're going to keep doing this myself and some of the folks I'm working with, and someone's interested, they can certainly reach out to me via Clint, and I'll be happy to put them in touch for us to be part of this question storming. What we found and we've done 2 of these sessions, what I find so interesting, and this is something we certainly want Denton to also participate in if you guys are interested, is that even when you talk to young people, because we had a session where we had people in their 20s on the call, there is such hunger to understand the psychological impact of not having trust in the community today. We had on one of the calls, we had a gentleman who's 22 years old, and he was so inspiring in the sense that what he said was, we need to really not just ask hard questions about trust, but we need to really try to get to what comes next around what will make them trust the future. How do you give them hope about the future, right? And I think an organization like Denton and others could certainly play a role in having an opportunity for us together with you guys and others to really have this hard conversation around trust. So that's something I certainly want to bring up. The last point I'm making, I'll be quiet, I promise you, Clint, is that one of the questions that keep coming up is, do we even understand why people don't trust one another? You know, and when I did an interview last week with Richard Haas of the Council on Foreign Relations, where I talk about with Dr. Haas what I call electricity diplomacy. And the whole notion about that is today, everyone in society is standing in their own bubbles. And so maybe an organization like Denton could try to sort of bridge the gap in society by bringing people from different parts of their bubbles to come closer together to have a common conversation, because the political bubble is not as interesting as the electrical bubble. Electricity, when you have different polarities, you attract each other. Unfortunately, in politics, what we see today is that different polarities repel each other. And so I'm just putting a plug in here that more people should ascribe to electricity diplomacy, which is what Benjamin Franklin did. So my only plug for that. Thanks, Glenn.
I love that, Lawrence. I did participate in one of your question storming sessions pre-COVID, and I had never seen that technique used before in the way that you used it. It was fascinating. I do want to accept your invitation to do a roundtable with our think tank on trust, and do it early on. And I might even invite Elliot to be a participant in that, because it's an interesting and very meaningful word, and one that came up in the majority of our presentations so far. And it, you know, I hear it at every location that I communicate with now, the absence of trust.
Yeah, and I mean, my partner in crime on this whole trust, we call it the trust crusade now on this, Sandra Bear, and she and I have been having a lot of conversations about this. And the last point I will make for Elliot, because I haven't spent much time with Elliot as I spent with you, Clint, but the last point I will make, Elliot, you talk about your kids, right? So I have young kids too. And for the audience, I must say, the psychological impact of this pandemic on young people of all ages is something we should really, really pay attention to, because I think they're supposed to be stepping up after we step down. And I don't think because they're working from home, studying from home, I think we do a disservice to them if we don't try to understand psychologically how they've been impacted. And this is something I think you guys at Denton have an opportunity to do. So thank you so much.
Thank you,
Amen.
Lawrence. Great job. Thank you, Elliot.